I am continuing in my reading. What I'm doing in this series is to read through the entire standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This consists of the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. I am continuing reading in a chronological order, according to event, not according to publication or volume. So I'm skipping around a bit as I move along. So we now read the Joseph Smith translation of John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. Now in my last reading, I did state that in the Joseph Smith translation, every verse had a correction. I was not quite accurate. There are a couple of verses that do not have a correction. And so I will be having both my Joseph Smith translation and my King James Version open, and we will reread all 18 verses. But we will read the Joseph Smith translation where it occurs, and the King James where there is no correction. So here we go, starting, of course, in verse 1. In the beginning was the gospel preached through the Son, and the gospel was the Word, and the Word was with the Son, and the Son was with God, and the Son was of God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made which was made. In him was the gospel, and the gospel was the life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in the world, and the world perceiveth it not. Notice the changes here, first of all. Now, it is not Christ who is the Word. The gospel is the Word, but the Word was with Christ in the beginning. The Word was with the Son. He preached the Word from the beginning. Even before the creation, the gospel was preached. The gospel was known to all of us before we were born. You'll also note that it is the gospel that is the life and light of men. The gospel in our lives is what makes our lives what they are. Christ, He's salvation. But for those who don't know about Christ, those who don't have the Word, those who don't have the gospel, they don't have anything for that light. They don't have that salvation. I find that interesting, that it is the gospel that is the light and the life. I also like, He shined in the world instead of shined in the darkness. All very interesting changes. But let us continue, verse 6. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came into the world for a witness, to bear witness of the light, to bear record of the gospel through the Son unto all, that through him men might believe. He was not that light, but came to bear witness of that light, which was the true light, which lighteth every man who cometh into the world, even the Son of God. He who was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, only to them who believe on his name. He was born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the same Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Notice a few changes here. John came not just to bear record of the Son, but to bear record of the gospel through the Son. See, as I said in my introduction, the gospel is the good news of the resurrection and the atonement of Christ. John didn't just come to bear witness that Jesus was the Son of God. He came to bear witness of that work of the atonement, of the gospel. And that's what was known in the pre-existence. We knew that we had a chance when we came down to this earth because it was already planned for Christ to come and perform the atonement. Now we also have this reference here, and I didn't mention in my last video, but the light which lighteth every man who cometh into the world, that's what we call the light of Christ. That inner conscience that stirs us, has an instinct of what is good and what is not. But I do also find this interesting. Down in verse 12, we had, gave power to become the sons of God, instead of even to them that believe, but now it's only to them that believe. And then, in the King James, it said, which were born, indicating that this is talking about the sons of God, that those who become the sons of God. But no, Joseph would change that to he was born. Now we're talking about Christ. Christ is not born by the will of man or anything, but by the power of God. That's an interesting change. But let us read these last few verses, starting in verse 15. John bare witness of him, and cried, saying, This is he of whom I spake. He who cometh after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. For in the beginning was the Word, even the Son, who was made flesh, and sent unto us by the will of the Father. And as many as believe on his name shall receive of his fullness, and of his fullness have all we received, even immortality and eternal life through his grace. For the law was given through Moses, but life and truth came through Jesus Christ. For the law was after a carnal commandment to the administration of death, but the gospel was after the power of an endless life through Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father. And no man hath seen God at any time, except he hath borne record of the Son. For except it is through him, no man can be saved. Got a few interesting things here too, because these 4 verses have some very profound changes, very profound corrections here, especially in 17, where we have that description of the purpose of the law, the administration of death. Those who are only under the law will only get death. They cannot be saved. They are only spiritually dead. That's all the law can do. All the law is able to do is condemn. It is through the mercy and the grace of Christ that we are able to be saved from the law. We are able to be brought back out of that condemnation because of Christ. I also like the verse 16. It said somewhat similar things in King James. In King James just has that brief, and of his fullness have all we received. But what John is saying here, and he says it more fully in the Joseph Smith translation, is he's talking to the members of the church. As I said in the introduction, his whole gospel is written to those who already believe, those who are already members and have embraced the gospel. And he is saying, look, it is through Christ that all this is possible. You have already received Christ. You have already received of his fullness. And so you already have, as he says, immortality and eternal life. Beautiful. Finally, verse 18, which is one that a lot of other Christians want to use in their attacks against the church, is no man hath seen God, only, as the King James says, at any time, the only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared it, right? But the correction here is beautiful. That except, no man has seen God except he bore record of the Son. The only time anybody sees the Father in mortality is when the Father is testifying of Christ. You don't even hear the Father's voice except to testify of his Son. Because it is through Jesus that all things are made possible. We don't look to the Father for salvation. We look to Christ for salvation. We worship the Father in the name of the Son because the Father is the highest. He is the one overseeing everything. But we look to Christ for our salvation, and so the Father, in honor of his Son, only speaks, only appears, only acts in mortality to bear witness of his Son. And we see this throughout the Scriptures. When they appeared to Joseph Smith, what did the Father? The only thing the Father said was, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." In 3 Nephi, when Christ appears, what does the Father say? "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, hear him." He is bearing record of his Son. Even at the baptism, which we will read shortly, when Christ is baptized, what does the Father say? "This is my Son." That is what it is. The Father, if he is going to appear, if you are going to hear the words of the Father, it will always be to testify of the Son. That is beautiful. And that is where we leave it for this video. We will continue in the next video to read the story of the baptism of Christ. So I will see you there.